They say that 26 is the age where you finally feel like a real adult, but you still carry the reckless, bulletproof confidence of a teenager who thinks the world owes them a masterpiece of an adventure. We were five best friends, a tight-knit circle that had survived college exams, messy breakups, and the soul-crushing grind of entry-level jobs in the States. And we decided it was finally time to do something legendary. Central Africa was the destination, a place that felt like another planet compared to the suburbs we grew up in. And the plan was simple. Safaris by day, way too much alcohol by night, and memories that would last a lifetime. I remember the flight over, the shared excitement vibrating through the cabin as we clinked tiny plastic bottles of gin, toasted to our freedom, and mapped out all the things we wanted to see. We landed in a wall of heat and humidity that felt like a physical weight, but we didn't care because we were finally there. And the first few days were a literal blur of neon-lit bars, dusty streets, and the kind of laughter that makes your lungs ache. We were constantly buzzed, floating on a cloud of expensive whiskey and cheap local beer, navigating the crowded markets and vibrant nightlife like we owned the place. Everything felt scripted, like we were the stars of some high-budget travel movie where nothing bad ever happens to the protagonists. We spent our mornings sleeping off hangovers in air-conditioned hotel rooms and our afternoons lounging by the pool or taking short, tourist-friendly excursions that felt safe and sanitized. But by the third night, the standard tourist experience started to feel a bit too predictable for some of my friends. We were sitting at this dimly lit bar tucked away in a side alley, the air thick with the smell of clove cigarettes and grilled meat. When we met him, he was a local guy who stood out because his English was absolutely flawless, delivered with a smooth, rhythmic cadence that made everything he said sound like a profound secret. He introduced himself and joined our table, and within an hour, he felt like a long-lost friend. He told us stories about the real Africa, the parts the travel brochures ignored, and then he leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, and offered us a secret excursion. He talked about a hidden valley that very few outsiders ever get to see, a place of raw, untouched beauty that would make our Instagram feeds look like child's play. My friends were hooked instantly, their eyes lighting up with the kind of drunken bravado that ignores red flags in favor of a good story. Mark was the most enthusiastic, already asking about the price and the logistics, while the others chimed in with excitement, their voices rising over the low hum of the bar. I sat there, nursing my drink, and felt this cold, sharp tug in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't something I could put into words, just a weird feeling in my gut that told me we were stepping off the map in a way we weren't prepared for. I looked at the guy, noticed how his eyes didn't quite match his smile, and for a second, I almost opened my mouth to say no. I almost told them that maybe we should just stick to the plan and go on the guided safari we had already paid for. But then I looked at my friends' faces, saw how happy and alive they looked in the flickering light of the bar, and I didn't want to be that guy. I didn't want to be the buzzkill, the paranoid one who ruined the vibe for everyone else just because I had a nervous twitch in my soul. I told myself I was just being anxious, that the alcohol was making me overthink things, and that this was exactly the kind of adventure we had come here for. So, when the local guy asked if we were in, I forced a smile, raised my glass with the rest of them, and went along with it, effectively silencing the only voice of reason I had left. We spent the rest of the night drinking even more, celebrating our luck and toasting to the real adventure that was supposed to start the next morning, completely unaware that we were already walking into a trap that none of us would ever truly escape from. The music in the bar seemed louder, the drinks tasted sweeter, and for a few more hours, the world was still beautiful and safe. We stumbled back to our hotel in the early hours of the morning, tripping over our own feet and shouting jokes into the empty streets, feeling like kings of the world. I remember looking at Mark as he laughed at something stupid I said, his face glowing under the streetlights, and feeling a brief wave of affection for these people who were more like brothers than friends. We were 26, we were in Africa, and we were about to see something no one else had seen. That was the last night I ever felt truly safe, the last night I could sleep without seeing the shadows that were already closing in around us. By the time the sun started to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, the deal was done, and our fate was sealed, all because I chose the vibe of the group over the screaming warning in my head. The sun hit us like a physical blow the next morning, a blinding and unforgiving light that made my head throb with the rhythmic remnants of the previous night's poor decisions. But the momentum of the group was an unstoppable force, and we were already piling into this beat-up 8-seater vehicle that looked like it had been through several wars and lost all of them. The interior smelled of stale cigarette smoke, old sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of diesel. A stark contrast to the luxury we had grown accustomed to in our hotel. But we were determined to keep the party going, so we even cracked open a few more drinks, the hiss of the cans opening providing a rhythmic backdrop to the rattling of the engine as we pulled away from the city. Our driver was a silent, stone-faced man who never looked at us in the rearview mirror, and the local guide sat up front, chatting away as if we were just going on a casual Sunday drive instead of heading deep into the unknown. For the first hour, we were still joking, making plans for when we got back to the States, and laughing at how much our parents would freak out if they could see us now. But as the urban landscape faded into a vast, empty stretch of nothingness, the conversation began to wither under the oppressive heat. The road transitioned from cracked asphalt to a dusty trail that kicked up orange clouds behind us, obscuring any view of where we had come from. And I noticed that the cell service bars on my phone had long since disappeared into a void. I tried to catch Mark's eye, looking for some of that infectious confidence he usually radiated, but he was staring out the window, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his baseball cap, and I felt that same cold knot of dread tightening in my chest. 3 hours into the drive, the landscape had become a monochromatic blur of scrubland and scorched earth, and the silence inside the van was becoming deafening, broken only by the occasional clink of an empty bottle rolling across the floorboards. I finally cleared my throat, my voice sounding thin and raspy even to my own ears, and asked the guide how much longer it would take to reach this secret destination. And he didn't even turn around. He just pointed a calloused finger toward the shimmering horizon and told us we were almost there. I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe that there was something beautiful waiting for us at the end of this long, uncomfortable journey. But then I saw it. A makeshift checkpoint carved out of the dust, manned by men who didn't look like any official soldiers I had ever seen. They were wearing mismatched camouflage and holding rifles that looked rusted but undeniably lethal, and as we slowed to a crawl, I felt my heart start to race against my ribs like a trapped bird. The guide looked back at us then, his expression unreadable and his tone suddenly professional, and told us in a low, steady voice that it was just a routine inspection and that we just needed to step out of the car for a moment so they could verify our documents. We complied like sheep, our movements sluggish from the heat and the alcohol, stepping out onto the baking ground where the air felt like it was being blown out of a furnace. Everything happened in a flash then. the kind of sudden violence that shifts the world on its axis, as one of the guards leveled his weapon directly at my chest, his eyes hard and void of any empathy. He started screaming at us in a language I didn't recognize, a guttural, aggressive sound that felt like a physical assault, and I stood there frozen, my hands half raised in a gesture of pathetic surrender. The guide, who had been our friend only hours before, stood slightly apart from us now, his voice cold and clinical as he translated the demands, telling us that we had to drop everything we had right there in the dirt. He told us to drop our cash, our wallets, our expensive watches that we had worn to show off. And then he pointed at our feet and said we had to take off our sneakers too. It was a surreal, humiliating moment, standing into the middle of a desert we didn't know, stripped of the basic comforts and symbols of our status, while armed men watched us with a hunger that had nothing to do with food. I looked at my friends and saw the same terror reflected in their eyes. The realization finally sinking in that we weren't in a movie. There was no production crew coming to save us, and the rules of the world we knew had been completely erased. We started fumbling with our laces, our fingers shaking so badly we could barely manage the knots, dropping our lives into a pile at the feet of men who looked at us like we were nothing more than a payday. The sun continued to beat down on us, indifferent to our fear, as the reality of our situation began to settle into our bones like a terminal illness. We were standing in our socks on the burning sand, vulnerable and exposed, while the guide we had trusted watched with a blank face, the transition from guest to victim complete in the span of a few terrifying minutes. The heavy silence that followed the shouting was even worse, a thick, suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe as we waited to see what would happen next, knowing deep down that the worst was yet to come. Every second felt like an eternity as I stared at the barrel of the rifle, wondering if this was the last thing I would ever see, and the regret I felt for not listening to my gut back at that bar was a bitter, acidic taste in the back of my throat. We were 26, we were lost, and we were completely at the mercy of men who had no reason to show us any mercy at all. The party was over, and the nightmare had only just begun, a realization that hit me with more force than any gunshot ever could. I wanted to scream, to bargain, to offer them anything just to turn back time. But there was no going back, only the vast, empty expanse of the desert waiting to swallow us whole. We stood there in a pathetic line, our shoulders slumped and our bare feet already feeling the searing heat of the ground, watching as they rummaged through our bags and threw our belongings into the dirt with a casual disregard that was more terrifying than the guns. They weren't just taking our money, they were taking our dignity and our safety, leaving us with nothing but the clothes on our backs and a growing sense of doom that none of us could articulate. The guide didn't even look at us anymore, his focus entirely on the loot, as if we had already ceased to exist in his world. And I realized with a jolt of pure panic that we were no longer people to them, just obstacles to be cleared. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the metallic tang of fear, and as the guards started gesturing for us to move, I knew that whatever happened next would change us forever, provided we even survived long enough to be changed. It was Jason who finally snapped, his voice cracking with a mixture of disbelief and misplaced American entitlement, as he started to argue, demanding to know what they thought they were doing and threatening them with the embassy and the police. But his words were cut short by a sound so loud and violent it felt like the sky itself had split open right above our skulls. A gunshot rang out, the muzzle flash a brief and terrifying spark in the midday glare, and the smell of gunpowder hit me like a physical wall, a sharp and sulfuric bite that signaled the end of any illusions we had left about this being a misunderstanding or a bad joke. The shockwave of the blast seemed to ripple through my very bones, leaving my ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the sounds of the wind. And in that moment of absolute white-hot terror, I realized we were being systematically robbed in the middle of a literal nowhere with no witnesses and no mercy. We moved like robots after that, our survival instincts overriding our pride as we stripped off every single thing of value, dropping our iPhones, our wedding bands, our hidden cash, and finally our sneakers until we were standing there in our thin socks, feeling the heat of the earth beginning to seep through the fabric. I looked at the local guide, the man who had laughed with us and shared our drinks just hours ago, and saw that the friendly mask had been completely discarded, replaced by a blank, predatory indifference that was more chilling than the rifles. He didn't even look like the same person anymore as he watched us tremble, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and hollow, telling us with a terrifying calmness that we were now free to go. I stood there, blinking back tears of rage and fear, and stammered out a question about what he meant, where we were supposed to go without a car or shoes or even a bottle of water. And he just gestured toward the infinite horizon with a slow, sweeping motion of his hand, and said we could do whatever we wanted. It was a death sentence delivered with a shrug, and before I could even process the cruelty of it, the guards started shouting again, their voices harsh and rhythmic as they began waving their guns and nudging us with the barrels, forcing us away from the road and toward the vast, undulating dunes of the burning desert. We were pushed further and further into the wasteland, the vehicle and the men eventually becoming small specks against the shimmering heat until they finally turned back, leaving us alone in a landscape that felt like the surface of the sun. We started walking because there was literally nothing else to do, our feet sinking into the fine, powdery sand that felt like walking on a bed of glowing coals, and within 20 minutes, the thin fabric of our socks had worn through, leaving our skin exposed to the abrasive, searing surface of the earth. We walked for hours through a heat so intense, it felt like it was trying to evaporate the very marrow in our bones. No shoes, no plan, and no direction other than away from the men who had just destroyed our lives. The silence of the desert was even more oppressive than the heat, a heavy and ancient stillness that seemed to mock our frantic, shallow breathing and the soft whimpers of pain that escaped from the group. Every step was a fresh agony, the sand grinding into the blisters that were already forming on our soles. But the fear of what was behind us kept our legs moving long after our brains wanted to quit. We were just 5 shadows drifting across a sea of orange and gold, trying to keep moving straight ahead while the panic started to settle into our bones like a terminal frost, a cold dread that even the African sun couldn't melt away. I remember looking at Mark and seeing the sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wide and unfocused as he stumbled along beside me. And I realized that the group dynamic had completely shattered. We weren't a team of friends on an adventure anymore. We were 5 individual animals trying to survive a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. The horizon never seemed to get any closer, just a shimmering, deceptive line that promised an end to the walking, but only delivered more sand and more heat with every passing mile. My mind started to play tricks on me, the thirst becoming a physical presence in the back of my throat that tasted like copper and dust, and I found myself hallucinating the sound of the ocean or the sight of a cold vending machine just over the next ridge, only to be met with the same brutal emptiness every time. We didn't talk much because talking required energy we didn't have and moisture we couldn't spare, so we just moved in a rhythmic, agonizing trance. The only sound the scuffing of our raw feet against the earth and the occasional sob from someone who had reached their breaking point. I kept telling myself that if we just kept moving, we would eventually find a road or a village or a person who wasn't trying to kill us. But the rational part of my brain was screaming that we were walking deeper into a trap that had been set long before we ever stepped foot on that plain. The sun began its slow descent, but it brought no relief. Only a shift in the colors of the desert that made everything look like it was bleeding. And as the shadows lengthened, the realization that we were going to be out here in the dark without fire or protection started to claw at my sanity. We were 26. We were supposed to be at the peak of our lives, but here we were, reduced to nothing more than prey, walking toward an uncertain end while the world we knew felt like a dream from another life. The panic was no longer a sharp, sudden thing. It had become a dull, constant ache, a companion that walked beside us in the dust, reminding us with every heartbeat that we were lost in a place that didn't care if we lived or died. Every time I looked back, the tracks we left in the sand were already being erased by the wind, as if the desert itself was trying to scrub away any evidence that we had ever existed. And that was the moment I truly understood that we weren't just lost. We were being forgotten by the world in real time. We kept moving because the alternative was to lie down and let the sand take us, and none of us were ready to give up yet, even if our bodies were already screaming for the end. But the light was fading fast, and the true test of our survival was lurking just beyond the next dune, waiting for the cover of darkness to reveal itself. The twilight was turning the desert into a graveyard of shadows when we first spotted a lone figure standing on a distant dune. A man who looked like a ghost, manifested from the dust. But instead of offering a hand or a word of comfort, he took one look at our bedraggled, bloodied group and bolted in the opposite direction with a speed that suggested he knew exactly what we were and what we represented. We stood there in a daze, our parched throats unable to even call out for help, and for about 30 agonizing minutes we just stayed huddled together in the cooling sand, hoping against hope that he was running to get water or perhaps a vehicle to rescue us. But the silence that followed was eventually broken not by the sound of an engine, but by the distant, rhythmic thrumming of approaching danger. He came back, but he wasn't alone. He was trailing a whole group of armed men who didn't look like they were there for a rescue mission, and as they fanned out across the sand with a practiced, predatory movement, it became clear that the hunt had shifted from metaphorical to literal. They started chasing us like we were prey, their shouts echoing across the dunes in a harsh, discordant symphony that made my heart feel like it was going to explode in my chest from the sheer, overwhelming pressure of the adrenaline. It felt like a sick action movie, the kind you watch from the safety of an air-conditioned theater with a bowl of popcorn. But the bullets literally flying past our ears were very real, making a sharp, terrifying zip sound as they displaced the air around our heads and kicked up plumes of orange dust only inches from our feet. Our legs were screaming for us to stop, the muscles seizing into hard knots and the raw, bleeding skin of our feet catching on every jagged rock and hidden thorn buried in the sand. But the survival instinct was a tidal wave that pushed us forward through the agony. We sprinted for our lives across the shifting sand, the world reduced to the sound of our own ragged, sobbing breath and the terrifying metallic crack of rifles behind us. And I remember thinking with a strange, detached clarity that this couldn't be how it ended. Not like this. Not in a place whose name I didn't even know. Every time a bullet hit the ground near me, I felt a new jolt of terror surge through my nervous system, forcing me to find a hidden reserve of energy I didn't think I possessed after hours of walking in the sun. We were stumbling, tripping over our own exhaustion and the uneven terrain, But the sight of a tiny, dusty town appearing like a shimmering mirage on the horizon gave us a final, desperate burst of speed that felt like it was tearing our lungs apart. We finally rolled into the outskirts of the settlement, collapsing against the rough, mud brick walls of the first buildings we reached, gasping for air that felt like liquid fire in our throats while our vision blurred and swam. We waited there, huddled in the deep shadows of an alleyway, expecting the men to round the corner at any second and finish what they started. But after a few minutes of agonizing silence, we realized the shooters had given up, likely unwilling to bring their violence into the town itself and draw unwanted attention. It felt like a miracle, a genuine gift from a God I hadn't spoken to in years, and for a few seconds, we just sat there in the dirt, weeping with relief and clutching at each other's tattered, sweat-soaked clothes as if we were trying to merge into a single, safe entity. But then the air shifted, a cold, sickening realization washing over me like a bucket of ice water as I looked around the small circle of survivors and felt a hollow drop in the center of my stomach. I started counting, my eyes darting frantically from face to face, and the math simply didn't add up because there were only 4 of us left huddled in that dusty alleyway, shivering despite the lingering heat. Mark was gone. The realization hit us like a physical blow to the head, a sudden and violent transition from the high of survival to pure, unadulterated horror that made my stomach turn and my head spin. We didn't care about the danger anymore. We scrambled back toward the edge of the town, our voices raw and cracking as we screamed his name into the darkening desert, pleading for a response, a shout, even a moan, anything that would tell us he was still out there. No matter how much we shouted until our throats bled, no matter how many times we called out for him to just show up or tell us he was hiding, the only thing the vast, indifferent wind gave back was the sound of our own desperation echoing off the dunes. We spent 30 minutes searching the immediate area where we had entered the town, our eyes scanning every shadow and every dip in the terrain, our hearts breaking a little more with every passing second of heavy, suffocating silence. We moved like ghosts through the outskirts, ignoring the curious and fearful glances of the local townspeople who watched us from their darkened doorways, until we reached the spot where the chase had been at its most intense, and the bullets had been thickest. And there, lying face down in the dirt like a discarded piece of trash, was his baseball cap, the same one with the faded team logo he had been wearing since the day we left the States, looking so small and insignificant against the vastness of the desert. It was the only thing we found, a small fabric reminder of a man who had been laughing and joking with us just hours before, and who was now swallowed by the void as if he had never existed at all. I picked it up, the material feeling heavy and unnaturally cold in my hands, and the weight of our collective failure crashed down on me with a force that felt like it would bury me right there in the sand. We stood there in a jagged circle around that cap, the reality of our situation finally reaching its most brutal and final conclusion. We had run for our lives, driven by a selfish, primal need to breathe, and in our panic, we had left our best friend behind to face whatever darkness had claimed him. The silence of the desert was no longer just empty. It was accusatory, a vast and indifferent witness to the cowardice that had saved our lives but cost us a brother. And as the sun finally disappeared completely, leaving us in a darkness so thick it felt tangible, I knew that a part of us had died out there in the sand with Mark. We couldn't go back out there, not without weapons or lights or any idea where to start. And the local people were already beginning to close their heavy wooden doors and turn away, leaving us alone with our grief and the terrifying, haunting question of what we were going to do now that our world had been permanently fractured. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him running. I heard the rhythmic snap of the bullets, and I wondered at what exact moment he had fallen or been taken. And the fact that I didn't know, that I hadn't even looked back to check, was a jagged blade turning in my heart that I knew would never stop cutting. We were 4 survivors, but in that moment, we felt more like ghosts than the man we had lost, haunting the edges of a world that had no place for us and no answers for the tragedy we had invited upon ourselves. The morning light filtered through the cracked shutters of a makeshift police station that smelled of ancient paper, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of a dying ceiling fan that clicked with every sluggish rotation. But the air inside offered no comfort as we sat there, huddled together on a wooden bench that felt like it was carved from stone. We tried to explain through tears and frantic, stuttering breaths what had happened. The guide, the guns, the dessert, the chase. But the officer behind the desk didn't even look up from the yellowed ledger he was slowly filling with cramped, illegible script. When he finally did raise his eyes, they weren't filled with the urgency or the resolve we expected. Instead, they were heavy with a weary, cynical kind of boredom that made my blood run cold. He didn't ask for a description of the men or the coordinates of where we were dumped. He just looked at our raw, bleeding feet and the dusty baseball cap I was still clutching like a holy relic. And then he leaned back, letting out a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 similar tragedies. He looked me straight in the eye and shrugged his shoulders, a casual, devastating movement that dismissed our entire existence and told us in a voice that was both flat and final that this is Africa and people disappear all the time. It was a sentence that didn't just end the conversation. It felt like it ended our hope, a sequence of words that I knew, even then, would haunt the corridors of my mind until the very day I die. He told us we were lucky to be breathing and that we should focus on getting out before the same people realized we were still in town. But the real shock came when he informed us that we weren't even in the country we had started in. Those men hadn't just robbed us. They had driven us across a porous, invisible border in the middle of that 3-hour nothingness, dumping us in a legal and geographical vacuum where our passports were useless and our presence was technically illegal. The realization that we had been kidnapped across international lines turned my fear into a cold, paralyzing nausea, making the world feel even larger and more predatory than it had in the desert. The next 2 days were a descent into a specific kind of pure hell that I didn't know existed, a blurred sequence of begging for use of a landline, trying to convince skeptical consulate officials over the phone that we weren't just some drunk tourists who had lost their way, and navigating a bureaucratic nightmare without a single cent to our names. We were shuffled from one dusty office to another, sleeping on the floor of a terminal and eating nothing but stale bread provided by a local charity, all while the image of Mark, standing alone in that sand, haunted every second of my waking life. The journey back to the States was a hollow, silent experience that stood in agonizing contrast to the rowdy, whiskey-fueled flight that had brought us there. On the way over, the plane had felt like a vessel of infinite possibility, but on the way back, it felt like a pressurized coffin, and every time the engines roared, I expected to hear the crack of a rifle or the sound of Mark's voice calling out for us to wait. We landed in the States looking like ghosts, our skins scorched a deep, painful red and our eyes sunken into our skulls, and stepping back into the mundane reality of an American airport was the most surreal experience of my life. People were complaining about delayed flights and the price of coffee, completely unaware that only a few thousand miles away, The world was a jagged, lawless place that swallowed young men whole without a second thought. Now that I'm back, the silence of my apartment is the loudest thing I've ever heard, and I spend every night lying in the dark, staring at the ceiling and watching the shadows shift like the dunes of that desert. I can't close my eyes without seeing that baseball cap lying in the dirt, and I still can't bring myself to look Mark's girlfriend in the eye when she comes over to ask for updates that I don't have. She looks at me with this desperate, fading hope, searching my face for some sign that he might still be out there. Maybe captured, but alive. Maybe waiting for a rescue that isn't coming. How do I explain to her the way the light looked when we ran? How do I explain that I didn't even turn around to see where he went, because the only thing I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the animalistic urge to keep my own heart beating? I try to tell myself that there was nothing I could have done, that we were unarmed and outnumbered, and that staying would have just meant 5 bodies in the sand instead of 1. But the logic feels like a thin, pathetic shield against the crushing weight of my own guilt. I keep asking myself if I could have done more, if I should have kept searching for more than 30 minutes, or if I should have grabbed a rock and fought back instead of stripping like a coward in the dust. The truth is a bitter, jagged pill that I have to swallow every morning when I wake up and realize I'm in a soft bed while he's somewhere in a nameless grave or wandering a wasteland that has no end. I was the one who had the bad feeling in the bar, the one who saw the red flags and chose to ignore them because I didn't want to be the guy who ruined the vibe. And that choice, that small, pathetic moment of social pressure, is what truly killed my best friend. I was a coward who ran away and left the best person I knew to die alone in the sand. And no matter how many years pass, or how much I try to move on, I know that I am still standing in that desert, barefoot and broken, watching the wind erase the tracks of the man I failed. Every time I see a baseball cap or hear the sound of a distant firework, I am transported back to that moment of pure, unadulterated terror, and I realize that while 4 of us made it back to the States, none of us ever truly left that desert. We are just shadows of the people we used to be, bound together by a secret that is too heavy to carry and a guilt that is too sharp to ignore, waiting for a day that will never come when we can finally say his name without feeling the taste of gunpowder in our mouths.